My name is Faustina Obeng Adoma. I am the Gender and Social Inclusion Focal Person for AICCRA Ghana. Basically, I work with the implementing partners and our collaborators to make sure that we try to mainstream gender and social inclusion in our products, in our dissemination approaches, and then we also try to have conversations around gender inequalities and generational inequalities in the societies that we are working in. When you are talking about CSA practices, we shouldn't assume that practices are gender neutral, because practice require that people have resources, people have certain knowledge and understanding to be able to take up the practices. So we first pay attention to the practices that we are sending to the communities. How do we make sure that those practices would work for women and for youth? How do we make sure that they have the resources that are required to take up those practices? And we pay attention to these things in knowing which practices we can actually prioritize. And then again, to also know that even in our prioritization doesn't mean the crops we are paying attention to, it's a crop that women are already engaged in. And if women are in there, what kind additional information can we add to it to make sure that it makes an impact in the lives of women? And for AICCRA, we are also thinking that practices are not just about the practices themselves, but then they should also come with the required climate information services that you can add to the practice. So the farmer wants to know that if the climate is going to look like this, what kind of practice should I take up? And importantly, if I need to take up a practice and the practice requires that I get access to a specific product, is that product readily available and can a woman afford it? So these are the things that we think about to provide a holistic approach that will make sure that the CSA practices themselves, the climate information services, and the actual access to the products are meeting the needs of women and youth. We have managed to prioritize practices that will not leave women worse off. So in prioritization, we make sure that we pay attention to practices that can actually reduce the labor burden on women. We also make sure that we prioritize practices that happens around crops that women are already engaged in. Then we are also working with the village savings and loans associations that already many women are part of. So as part of our sustainable finance model, we are trying to see how we can connect these village savings and loans association to rural banks within the communities that we are working in, and see how we can use that as a way of connecting to impact investors who would now be willing to work with input providers such that women can access the improved seeds, improved varieties, and then the kinds of biopesticides we are talking about to be able to actually take up the CSA practices. So that is one thing we are doing. And then we also realize that access to resources, the gaps in access to resources that we see are actually also influenced by some fundamental cultural norms that define who gets what and who gets to use what resource, right? So as much as we want to close the gaps, we also want to start having conversations on how the community itself can work around the norms that have created these inequalities. So we have started conversations in the communities around some of these inequalities. Our whole idea is that when we bring that awareness and communities start talking about some of these inequalities, then they will start reflecting on what they can do in their own small ways to start making incremental changes towards some of these norms. So we've realized that when it comes to enhancing access to CSA, CIS, market information or finance to women, it requires us to work from multiple dimensions. It requires us to look at the partners that are working with the communities. It requires us to look at other past interventions that have happened in the communities. It requires us to look at the existing community structures themselves that are already in place, right? So it means that we have to think about what kinds of partnerships we can forge with what kinds of groups of people or what kinds of entities, such that the multiple resources or dimensions that we need to approach the gender issue from and the kinds of impact pathways we are looking at could happen. For instance, already the Ministry of Food and Agriculture has a gender unit that works through their extension services. So there is a Women in Agriculture Development Unit within many of our districts. And for us, if we are able to work in partnership with these women in agriculture units across our intervention areas, then we are able to create the landscape where beyond this project, these women groups that we would be able to strengthen or capacitate would still work together with the existing structures for the sake of sustainability and for accessing other services that already exist within the communities. And for many of these communities too, women do not have direct access points to the sources of some of these things. So it requires that somebody actually carries a practice or a product to these women. And so we need a lot of partnership with intermediaries that can access, for instance, the digital technologies that we are using to disseminate many of our climate information services. It requires that we have intermediaries that can access these services and to transmit these services to the farmers. And for this, we have seen that a partnership with the local radio stations or community information centers is very critical, since many women do not have access to cell phones themselves.